Dear friends, good evening, and thank you for joining us one more evening into our lecture series in our pre-chamber. Tonight, we would like to cover the topic on the Age of Pisces and the Age of Aquarius. This is one of those transitional lectures because soon after we cover this material, we start digging into some of the Gnostic mysteries. And as a preamble to those Gnostic mysteries, we need to understand the differences in the impact at the level of the psyche when it comes to the effect of the era of Pisces and what is the new effect on the age of Aquarius. For us to be able to understand that, we have to have some basic understanding on these celestial mechanics. And for that, we have to start talking about the Sidereal Year. Because just like we have a terrestrial year, which is the amount of time that it takes our Earth to go in orbit around the sun, well, so does our solar system as it orbits the central sun of the constellation of the Pleiades. Our solar system is the seventh of the seven sisters that make up the Pleiades, and the central sun of the constellation of the Pleiades is known as the Sun of Alcyone. Our solar system, every so often, completes a complete orbit around the central sun of Alcyone. And that orbit is known as a sidereal year. And the amount of times that it takes for that complete orbit to manifest is roughly in the vicinity of around 26,000 years. The best approximations indicate that it is closer to 25,968 years, of course, with its errors and fractions of decades and years and months and days, etc., etc. But as we go and complete the whole cycle around the sun of Alcyone, every 2,164 years or so, we transition from the influence of one constellation onto the next one. As you observe the symbols of the zodiac that we have for you on the screen, this translation, as we go from one constellation onto the other, it happens in a counterclockwise motion. And notice that as we go from the era of Pisces, we transition once again to the influence of the constellation of Aquarius. Being under one influence or another is of tremendous relevance. Because as we have learned in our lecture on the development of the personality, well, here within our solar system, there are 7 distinct archetypes that are influencing us on a constant basis. These archetypes are the souls of the moon and the soul of the sun, as much as the soul of Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn. These souls or archetypes are what is known in Christianity as the archangels. And the soul of the sun, that archetype of the sun, well, we have learned already that it is Archangel Michael or Michael. We know that the archetype of the moon is Gabriel. We know that the archetype of Venus, the planet of love, is Archangel Uriel, etc. And we also learned in that lecture on the development of the personality that the 7 days of the week are directly associated to the influences of these peculiar archetypes. So we have the influence of the archetype of the sun in what we experience today as Sunday. We have the influence of the archetype of the moon in what we know as Monday. We know that we have the influence of the archetype of Saturn in what we have today as Saturday. And just as we have influences of these great masters, these superior intelligences in each one of our days, well, in each one of these zodiacal periods, we experience influences from the archetypes that are the primary intelligences of each one of these constellations. When it comes to the age of Pisces, this last age that we experienced up until the 1960s, the influences in the psyche of mankind were instinctive and they were brutal. This is a period of around 2164 years where man did not know how to transmute the waters of life. And what is interesting, of course, is that Pisces shows us as its symbol fish in the waters. The fish in the waters indicate the ability not only to navigate, but to dominate, to also exist in harmony and in equilibrium. And it begs the question, well, if the fish is a symbol of that wisdom and the waters are a symbol of the waters of life, why is it that man did not know how to transmute the waters of life? It so happens that it is under the direct influence of the planet Neptune and the archetype of Neptune that in periods of 164 years, the schools of mystery go from periods of activity to periods of rest. And this last period of activity, well, it started not too long ago with the culmination of the era of Pisces and with the emergence of the Age of Aquarius. During the period in which we were under the direct influence of this constellation of Pisces, the native influence in the psyche of men is known as the influence of Mammon. And Mammon, as we see him here in this particular artistic rendition, well, he looks like a vulture. And notice how everything around it lacks color. It shows an environment that is brutal and aggressive, and in a way, the period under the constellation of Pisces was creating similar influences in the psyche of men. It is the influence of Mammon what leads mankind to focus tremendously on the intellect. As we focus on the intellect, that has some disadvantages, because the more we centralize ourselves on the functions of the intellect, the more we limit ourselves to restrict the information that we receive just from the physical senses of the human machine. Because we used to focus so strongly on the intellect, we would see that what was important was the appearance of the thing, because that is what the eyes could perceive, what the nose could detect, what the ears could listen to, perhaps what we were able to touch and experience through our physical senses. But the appearance of the thing is indeed very limited, because even though we refer to what we can perceive through our senses as objective, our physical senses are indeed subjective enough. We know this when, for example, two people sit and at the same table they are given the same meal, and one of them will say, this is great, and the other one will say, eh. We know that senses by themselves are subjective. When we can have two people in a room under the same atmospheric environmental conditions, and one of them will say, feels chilly in here, and the other one would say, I think it's fine. So there is subjectivity in the way that we perceive, simply because it is the congregation, the total sum of the psychological aggregates that exist within us, what is assuming ownership of the human machine, and as it receives the signals that come through the senses, the psychological aggregates themselves will incorrectly translate the information that they receive. Focusing on the appearance of the thing against considering what would be the thing itself is what has led us today in this path of degeneration to focus more on, for example, addressing symptoms and alleviating the symptoms rather than focusing on identifying the problem itself and indeed the root cause of the problem. This impact on the focus of the intellect applied to the scientific perception of the phenomena of nature. And as a consequence, man and their minds started forcing phenomena to conform to its concepts. This is what opens the door to the even greater discoveries of science. Because forcing the mind or tailoring the mind to conform to the concepts of these phenomena of nature, well, it has left so much information untouched, undiscovered, that when we open ourselves to that which is new, the ability to perceive new things then leads to further scientific discoveries and the elimination of old theories. Science, even to this day, still does not understand the true capabilities and the capacities of the human body. But hopefully, as the Age of Aquarius continues to make progress, because we just recently started the new Age of Aquarius, well, hopefully science will continue to catch up as science has started to speak in a language that resonates very well with the ancient teachings. Well, in that very same way, science will continue seeing an evolution in which it will tap into and tear the veil of mystery to understand the greater capacities of the human body. Some of these capacities exist today, and we have been able to see some of this stuff already. This image that you see here on the screen, well, it's an image that shows that there is a monk, what appears to be a Buddhist monk, that is submerged in a vat of boiling oil. And this man appears to be calm, composed, even under that very aggressive and adverse circumstance. There was a study performed at Harvard that shows that Tibetan monks can significantly raise the temperature of the fingers. They can significantly raise the temperature of their toes and other extremities just by meditation alone. There are many accounts of these monks and how is it that they can submerge themselves into a deep state of relaxation. And as they do that, they can tap onto powers in which wet clothes on them will start releasing steam because they heat their body to such a degree that all of the water evaporates. These faculties are not new. The ability to alter willfully the temperature of the human body, the ability to reduce much of the vital functions of the body to conditions that would appear bare minimum to sustain life, the ability to make changes into the body itself are faculties that have existed throughout all of history. And those great men, of course, when we say men, we're speaking in epicent terms. We mean both men and women. Well, these great men, they were referred to decades ago as quote-unquote mutants. They were able to change their shape and return to their original state without suffering any damage. These great masters were able to get into such a deep state of relaxation at the level of the mind, the emotion, and the body, that they would become a true vehicle for the manifestation of their spirit through the vehicle itself, and they would be able to levitate. Many are the stories of St. Francis of Assisi, and how is it that as he submerged himself in that deep meditation, in that profound prayer, he would naturally levitate, and in sustaining that ecstasy, he would stay elevated way up there in the dome of the cathedral. And his loyal servant, well, he would get very frustrated because he would bring him lunch for him to eat, and he would have to wait for St. Francis to come back from that profound state of ecstasy and lower himself down onto the ground. And just like St. Francis of Assisi, there were many other great masters, like St. Stanislaus, Hungary, which was also able to levitate. There are stories of Babaji in the India, a man who was able to make use of these superior faculties and live underwater for indefinite periods of time. Men like Ananda, Buddha's disciple, who was able to simply walk through walls of rock by simply working on increasing that manifestation of the spirit through his body. That in these modern days, people speak in terms of just quote unquote raising their vibrations. They were able to do these feats because they learned and they were granted the opportunity to penetrate with their physical body into the fourth dimension of nature. And that fourth dimension of nature is the ethereal plane. Within our own body, well, we know that this conglomerate of skin and bone and vascular system and nervous systems, well, this is just a construct of the mind. We have come to clearly understand that when we are touching things, the sensations of touch that we experience, they are indeed electrical impulses. Because at the atomic level, what we see is the interaction of electric fields that are in a constant exchange with each other. So the physical body is not just all that it seems to be. The physical body is certainly a beautiful treasure that we have been given, a good vehicle so that we can make use of its faculties, transmuting of our creative energies so that we can make energy available not only for our spiritual practice, but for the elimination of our inferior aspects. But with the fanaticism that we have developed with sensation, with the many considerations that for us to consider ourselves alive, we either need to do certain things or be certain things or have certain things, we have created psychological dependencies. The greatest one, the strongest one that we have today is just the psychological dependency in money. Many of us, as we get to some age, we realize, money's really not that important. And we start noticing the other beautiful opportunities and things that life has to offer. But for the most part, the psychological dependency in money is tremendous. And this is just what the ego wants. Because when it comes to the concept of money, if you were to think of money as condensed energy, you can then see very clearly why is it that people who have much of it, well, they are powerful. And the more you have of it, the more powerful and influential you seem to be. So this dual nature of matter and energy not only has a profound effect in our psyche, it also does in our emotion, and it also does at the level of our psyche. We have the opportunity through the teachings and the doctrine of Gnosis to penetrate into spaces where these faculties, abilities, these powers can become available to us. And we are so fortunate to find ourselves in the space where we are today. Because in the era of Pisces, when it came to those who practiced Gnosis openly, there was a huge consequence. There were many men, many women who were tortured, who were burnt at the stake, simply because they had already been able to awaken many of these faculties. And if they had any opportunity to create an influence within the forces of nature, rather than others seeing that as normal, they would immediately think, witchcraft. Men, and lamentably, many women died at the stake. They were tortured because they were immediately associated with the devil. The era of Pisces, a time that lasted close to 2200 years, saw the emergence of the great master of all masters, which is Yeshua ben Pandira. We know Yeshua as Jesus, and we refer to him as Jesus Christ. And because of that, every time that we tend to hear the word Christ, we immediately associate it with the shape of this man who used to walk on water and exercise miracles of turning water into wine, etc. This great matter, Jesus Christ, that Christ name is indeed a title. Because Christ, as a force of nature, can experience itself the opportunity to incarnate through any particular practitioner who has gone through the necessary transformations, the necessary changes, the right expiation to be able to purify himself at the level of the mind, the heart, and the soul, and receive this force to help them transition into the realm of those who are known as sons of men. Because the great Master Jesus came to deliver tremendous teaching as part of his life, and tremendous teaching as part of what has been written in a book called the Pistes Sophia, the writings of the great Master in those 11 years after the resurrection. People tend to believe that Jesus is a messenger. But Jesus was not a messenger. The great Master Jesus is the Savior of the world. He is the Master of all the masters. The fact is that the great messenger that came to announce the arrival of this Master was indeed John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is the avatar of the era of Pisces. The great Master Jesus came to deliver a teaching that is what we today are seeing as this aggregation of the very best to be learned from the Zen Buddhism, the very best to be learned from the Hindu tradition, the very best of Kabbalah, the very best of all of these world's great religions, that is indeed the teachings of Gnosis. But as the clock continued its ticking, we eventually got to a critical moment in the history of our mankind. As our solar system continued its path along the sun of Alcyone, it eventually reached the outer limits of the constellation of Pisces, and it walked into the influences of the constellation of Aquarius. And this particular transition is what is known as the arrival of the new age of Aquarius. And this event is out there for everyone to see because it manifested itself on the 4th of February of the year 1962. A beautiful congress of planets where alignments took place under the constellation of Leo, under the constellation of Aquarius, that opened the door to the arrival of this new age, and with it, a new influence for mankind so that men could break away with the influence of Mammon that was, again, very heavy on the intellect, very heavy on the matters of money and saving money and being austere, to now bring in a time in which the psyche of men became more revolutionary, where men started noticing that there was something else other than just studying and following rules and being bound to jobs just to be able to receive some cash and save it to deal with only difficult times. This new influence is known as the influence of Dionysius, or the Dionysian influence. And with the arrival of the constellation of Aquarius into our psyche, we see that there is a planetary influence that is also present. Aquarius by itself is revolutionary in nature. And when we complement that revolutionary impulse with the influences of the planet Uranus, what we see is a direct influence in the sexuality of mankind. So with the arrival of the new age of Aquarius, as we go back in time and we see images of what was happening in the 1960s, we see men, and of course women, emerging as part of that new generation that were revolutionary. They were open to a sexuality that was more aggressive. There were moral standards that changed. And of course, we're not even suggesting, not even remotely, that all of those changes were certainly favorable, but rather limiting ourselves to show the dramatic difference in expression between the man of Pisces and the emergent man of Aquarius. What happens with us is that the influence that we get from the archetype of the planet Uranus, because it influences our sexual organs directly, as the planet changes the orientation of its magnetic polarities to the sun, it creates, in periods of between 60 to 80 years, changes on Earth where we see that the woman is the sexuality that is dominating, and later on we see that it is the sexuality of the male, the one that is indeed dominating. With these influences of the planet Uranus, with this arrival of the Dionysian influence as well into our psyche, we then have an opportunity to enjoy of a subliminal sexual delight. Practices that go beyond the instinctive animal impulses of the sexuality that most people know of and practice today. These new influences give us the opportunity with this doctrine to learn how to take our creative waters, those creative waters that are known as the ens seminis, the entity of the seeds, and transmute this in such a way where we can extract solar and lunar atoms that exist within our creative waters and route them through specific channels in the physical body that eventually awaken of a superior fire. A fire known in the Hindi tradition as the fire of Kundalini. A fire that awakening it brings no danger at all, regardless of what you may see on the internet. No danger, because the awakening of Kundalini is never mechanical. It is never automatic. It is an awakening of a fire that is measured by virtue of the merits that exist within the heart of man. The transmutation of these waters, the awakening of Kundalini, lead us into a series of internal transformations that result in us awakening our consciousness, what people refer to as illuminated. It brings us the faculty of objective knowledge. That knowledge is the knowledge that goes beyond what the mind can perceive. It goes beyond the constant comparisons of the mind. It goes beyond the forcing of our experiences and fixed ideas into the phenomena of nature, so that we can truly experience with the faculties of our own innermost. Those faculties of imagination and inspiration and intuition. This is what explains why great men like Nikola Tesla never sketched any drawings, because he was able to see the phenomena itself, and thus he was able to materialize it accordingly. This is why we see great masters like Johann Sebastian Bach that would sit and hear the music of the spheres, and without any comparisons or considerations, he would be able to draw his pentagram and then write down his music without any mistakes in his compositions. These powers grant us the ability of a superlative intuition. where you not only feel the thing, but you immediately extract the significance of the thing itself. You clearly understand the reason why the thing is happening. And all of this happens without you even have to even exercise a single thought. This gives us the opportunity to listen to the music of the great masters and to receive this music that is transcendental in nature and nourish the superior intellectual and the superior emotional centers that exist within our human machine. But those of you who know a little bit of history, well, we all know that with the arrival of the new Age of Aquarius, we see an influence that immediately becomes split. One path of that Dionysian influence is the path of Gnosis. The other path is a path that is inferior in nature and is what has come to be known as the hippie movement. The hippie movement will, of course, move by these revolutionary forces, influenced by the forces of the archetype of Uranus that is entirely sexual in nature. Well, it led into infrasexuality and infrasexual practices. They are referred to as infrasexual because they fall below the condition of what is known to be normal sexuality. A sexuality that driven strictly by an instinctive impulse will come to satisfy certain economy of nature. You see, this infrasexuality is entirely focused on sensations. Its sole purpose is to use one body with another to be able to extract pleasure from it, regardless of the consequences. Because the influence of Aquarius is so revolutionary, because the Dionysian influence is inviting of experiences that exist beyond what we have here. Well, with the hippie movement, we see the use of drugs and using drugs as an artificial method to reach quote-unquote heightened states of consciousness. Because of these influences, well, then we see that there is a music that breaks path and that breaks away from traditional practices of music. Music that some refer to as infernal music. Music that is dissonant, music that is deafening, and music that is relatable to some simply because of the revolutionary message that exists within it. And this combination of an inferior sexuality, the artificial states of heightened consciousness, and the inferior vibrations of this inferior music, they all come together to create this psychedelic picture that is completely opposite to the experience of meditation. Man seeks for a way to liberate himself, to break with the shackles of abuse and oppression, and rather than looking within, with the hippie movement, man comes to look outside for all those things that have always existed within the heart of man. When it comes to the usage of drugs, well, just like with alcohol, there always seemed to be some kind of moral pain, the need to be able to escape a condition that is perceived as one of suffering. And of course, this brings into the conversation of what is happening at the level of our internal life and what is happening at the level of our external life. Externally, well, we all know that we have been fooled many times before. We know that we have been betrayed by people who we felt they were close to us, by people that we trusted. We know that we have felt the sting of resentment whenever things that are perceived to be unfair have happened to us. When we have been deprived of opportunities, when certain conditions have been simply taken away from our hands. Because of that externally, well, we feel that we have been taken advantage. In that very same light, we start developing a series of self-considerations where we see ourselves in certain way, where we believe that we behave in certain ways. And whenever people mention something that is different, when people challenge this external image that we have created of ourselves, we feel eluded, offended. This has thrown the psyche of man into downward spirals where the self-considerations and the self-esteems and the vanities and the desires, because they have become fractured. Because reality has shown that it's really not what we thought that we were. Well, many men start feeling sorry about themselves. They start feeling sorry about their lives. On one hand, they would like to be recognized of their achievements, of their capabilities, and yet that does not happen. And for as long as we continue looking outside and facing all of that chaos, well, then drugs become a good alternative to create an artificial condition, to help us disconnect from the harsh reality that we have to face. And as a consequence, drugs destroy the capabilities of the brain. They impair certain functions that ultimately affect our ability to connect internally with our authentic being, with our Father who is in secret. We speak about the faculties of the brain, and there is plenty out there that we can share. But we wanted to share here with you just a little study that was shared as one of those scientific reports available in some website called nature.com. This particular study speaks about the manifestation of alpha waves within the brain. It says alpha waves are electromagnetic oscillations in the frequency range of 8 to 12 hertz that arise from synchronous and coherent electrical activity of large groups of neurons in the human brain. Our scientists have been so fascinated with the neural network responses that take place within those great masters of meditation. Whenever they submerge themselves into a meditative state, as they scan the electrical activity of the brain, they see that the brain is more active. The neurons are firing more consistent. The light that emanates from that activity is remarkable compared to just the typical brain activity of someone who has no type of spiritual aspirations. In this particular study, what they come to see is a direct comparison between those who are singing religious words of power, religious chanting. Think of yourself as chanting mantras, words like the mantra of the Prajna Paramitas. Gate, 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 para samgate, bodhi swaha. Words that in Sanskrit, they mean liberation, liberation, liberation. To the other side of the river, all of humanity, illumination, hallelujah. When these practitioners submerge themselves with these words of power, this mantra, the relaxation that takes place in the body, at the emotional center, at the brain, it leads for the operation and the manifestation of superior faculties that start being noticed as these stronger neural network connections. And in the studies that you see here, what you see in these three distinct bars is that those people who are under the influence of the religious chanting, well, the activity in their brain is indeed statistically different to the activity that happens on the neural networks of those who are not chanting. They're simply resting, or those who are chanting things that are not of a religious nature. This is why you see all those little p-values that are all below 0.05. But you see here the word religious, and many people cringe because we have been taken advantage of before. Because religious leaders, many of them have come to us offering certain things and they have not delivered. Because some religious leaders have taken away much from us in terms of time and resources, and in many cases, hard-earned money that perhaps some of us needed for something else. And because we have been taken advantage of, we tend to react. But we will invite you to look at this word religious, not for the context that you may have created today. See this word religious for what it truly means in its etymology. Because religious comes from the Latin root word religare. And religare means to reunite. The same thing that means the word yoga. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit yug, that means to reunite. It is the reunion of your consciousness, of your essence, of that psychic material that you have been given so that you can crystallize a soul. It is the reunion of that with the source, with the spirit, with the innermost. This is why these religious chantings are important, because they are not religious as in fanatical. They have a purpose of bringing back reunion. And this is why this mantra of the Prajna Paramitas is so significant. Because when they say liberation to the other side of the river, it is to that next generation of true men. Those that today some of us call devas, or we call masters, or we call angels. There is a way to get there. And the way to get there is given to us openly during this new age of Aquarius. Lamentably, as a society, we continue moving down this path. That is a path of degeneration. And today we find ourselves surrounded by what some refer to as quote-unquote monster children. Children who exercise very violent behavior. We can notice this with explosive temper tantrums. We can see the physical aggression towards others, and in many cases, towards their own selves. Will they mutilate their body? Will they burn it? They create damage to their human vehicle. We see the expressions of frustration and violence and fighting in threats attempting to hurt others, including thoughts of wanting to kill others, regardless of who the other may be. We see how they embrace the use of weapons, and we see how is it that they are so cruel, not only to themselves, but cruel to their friends, cruel to their parents, cruel even towards animals. The image that we have on the screen, we captured it deliberately because this was what was considered to be a fun action from the perspective of this young woman. And she was being filmed by a friend as she was standing at the edge of a cliff and she was tossing a puppy into the abyss. This is the cruelty that we're speaking of. This lack of understanding, as they say in Buddhism, these obscurations and this ignorance, where they are not able to see that there is an essence of divinity in everything that exists. We see these monster children creating fires and bringing destruction, intentionally destroying property, vandalizing, whether it is their own school or someone else's car who is parked along the sidewalk. There are many studies that have been done about violent behavior in children and adolescents. And what we see is that this is not something that is getting better. If anything, we see that there are inferior aspects that every time seem to be more prevalent, more powerful. Friends, this behavior that we see in these children, we could clearly say, yeah, that's them, but that would be a mistake. Everything that we see expressed in them also exists within each and every one of us. As we walk into the intermediate level studies, the very first lecture that we go through is titled, Why We Judge Others. And if we could give you a good summary of that, we judge others simply because we don't know ourselves. Because we don't know ourselves, we don't know what exists within our own psyche. And when we are judging others, what we are in reality seeing is a reflection in the mirror of those things that exist within us, that we despise so much, that we do not even want to confront them. We judge others simply by ignorance, because what they do, we do. We may not do it as blatantly as they do it, but we figure out more subtle ways to still get it done. And the key takeaway here is that this reflection that we are seeing on the outside, all of these inferior conditions of chaos and destruction and abusive children, etc., this is all a reflection of what we all carry within. And because we are all caught in this very same downward spiral, the arrival of the new age of Aquarius clearly states that we have completed one more cycle. It clearly states that we as a humanity, that we are mature enough to receive the karma that we have earned. What you see on the screen is a birth chart of exactly what happened to this planet the 4th of February of the year 1962. And notice how, as you look at the zodiacal belt that makes the outer ring of this chart, you will see that there is a conglomeration of planets under the constellation of Aquarius. For those of you who have already learned the symbols of the planets, you can see that there is the moon, and there is also the sun. We can see that there is Mars, that there is Saturn. We can see that there is Venus. We can see that there is Mercury. We can see that all these planets are here. And while we are under the influence of Aquarius, and on the opposite side of that circle, what is looking at us is the constellation of Leo. And Leo is the lion of the law. Leo is looking at us saying, humanity, you are mature enough and you need to be ready for what is coming. Here we see also the influence of Uranus. Here we also see the influences of Saturn. All of them under that constellation of Aquarius. And it is favorable for us when we make use of these planetary forces and the influences of these archetypes in our daily activities. Because when we work with those forces of Saturn, Archangel Orifiel, who is the angel of death, well, he helps reveal to us the mysteries of death. How is it that we can get rid of all of this that is inferior in us so that we can take that leap onto the other side of the river? When we see the influence of Mars, that archangel, Samael, that is known as the god of war in the ancient Greek tradition, well, Samael has the influence over combat, war, action. And it is not a war that is to be manifested outside, but within our own selves. So that we can then see those inferior aspects, and like the Overwatch at the time of war, that we can observe them, understand them, comprehend them, to invoke of a power superior to the mind, to see them eliminated. Because every time we eliminate them, we add into that awakened consciousness so that it becomes more radiant, so that our heart will eventually shine with the intensity of 1,000 suns, so that the fire of Kundalini can awaken and that it can become truly manifest as that fire of Pentecost that we see clearly as the flame over the heads of the apostles, or like the light that emanates from the heads of the angels and the saints, or like the hair that is emanating from the crown of the Buddha, symbol of a fire that is active, of faculties that are awake, of a man who has been truly transformed. This era of revolution that is Aquarius, it gives us the opportunity for us to transform from within. And we should make benefit of the influence of the archetype of Uranus. Because if we know that our psyche has become revolutionary in nature, and we can make the best use of those circumstances to eliminate what is inferior in us, if we make use of this sexual influence of Uranus, and we apply that superior sexuality for our transformation, then we give ourselves a good opportunity. Then, when we live life in a way that embraces right action and right thought and right sentiment, we can then start living our lives in a way that is similar to what is taught in the ancient Buddhism when they say, we do not live for this life, we live for the next one. Friends, if we take advantage of these forces and we focus on getting rid of those undesirable aspects that exist in our mind, if we are able to allow for the birth of faculties, powers, abilities, doesn't matter how you want to call them, and we allow for our spirit, our innermost, to operate through us, through our words, through kindness, with the use of our personality, with using our gestures, if we become true, delicate instruments of the innermost, every time that we exercise that great work for others, that we sacrifice for the benefits of others, we start growing when it comes to the merits of our heart. And by the time that death comes and the physical body ceases to work and exist, eventually the great law will return us into a new womb, a new body, and a new opportunity. The better we live today in favor of others means that as we continue making changes towards higher levels of being, better opportunities, better conditions, a better life awaits for every one of us until that day where the chain of transformation renders us a son of man and later on a son of God. Dear friends, we are very grateful to all of these sources for these images because thanks to them we were able to put this together and make it available to you. And dear friends, this has been the lecture, The Age of Aquarius, The Age of Pisces. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening.